Day 3 of the Superbet Poland Rapid and Blitz saw the conclusion of the rapid portion of play, with the Chinese number 2 Wei Yi continuing his fantastic run to end up in the lead as we cross the halfway mark of the tournament. Checking out the standings, Wei Yi scored 2.5 out of 3 today to jump into the lead with 13 out of a total of 18 points possible, ahead of world number 1 Magnus who only scored 2 out of 3. Once again, I'll remind you folks that rapid wins count as 2 points in this format, with draws counting for 1. Meanwhile, Pragna kept his position of 3rd place after drawing all of his games today. Going into tomorrow, the players will now have 2 days of blitz, the 18 rounds total, and each game counting for 1 point as usual for a win and a half point per draw. Jumping into today's games, we'll start with the round 7 game between the world number 1 Magnus and Pragna, who is in 3rd place in this tournament. Here, coming from an Italian game, at this point Prag decided on the really thematic break with d5, but he does get into a little bit of trouble here. After e takes d5, e takes d4, Magnus trades and now pushes c4, gaining some space on the queen side. The idea c takes d5 and c5, playing against the bishop on a7 and looking to regain the d-pawn with a nice structure. Magnus was definitely better in this one, but Prag defended quite well, getting some counterplay with a5 and a takes b4. The engine was liking rook to b1 here for white, but what Magnus did was also quite good, and he did have chances in this one all the way until the endgame here. Bishop d7, bishop to b5, takes, rook a2, and there was one chance for Magnus here after rook to c4. He ends up going bishop to a1, which is a bit soft. C takes b7 was a very interesting try, where after rook takes c3, g3, the bishop drops back, and here either rook to a1 or rook takes e4. White would definitely have chances and is likely going to win the piece back eventually for the b-pawn. Also possible for white back here was the move knight to e2, which the engine quite likes, giving white some serious winning chances as well. Instead, bishop a1 was played, and this one soon gets liquidated after knight f4. Magnus does end up winning 1 pawn, but quickly allows Prag to trade everything off here, and eventually this game was agreed a draw, as the players just get this completely equal rook endgame. This allowed Wei Yi to pull ahead with a very nice win against Noterbeck Abdus Satov. Here, Wei Yi goes for the surprising move knight f5, which the engine doesn't like, but actually is quite practical. After takes, it's not easy for black to play this position. Apparently, bishop takes f5 followed by king to h8 was the way to handle it. What Noterbeck did was just play king h8 right away, looking to take back on e6 with a pawn. But this does give white a very, very big advantage here, as black's central pawns are weak, and Wei Yi is able to build up very, very nicely in the center. This game was a little bit back and forth, but for the most part, Wei Yi kept his advantage throughout this middle game. Dark square bishop, just a very, very strong piece on this board, and black's king really weak in the long run. However, this game ended up being decided in the endgame, as the players do trade off some pieces here. White having a huge advantage. Extra pawn now, just a big advantage in piece activity as well, but not a lot of time on the clock at this point. Noterbeck is down to about a minute, and Wei Yi just 15 seconds playing on the increment. So eventually black does take the bishop on d4, and the players trade rooks into this queen endgame. G takes h5, and this one is very, very good for white, but at this point Noterbeck blunders. He should have just tried to give checks like queen to d5, keep the queens on the board, and the position would be difficult for white to win. Instead, he grabs the pawn with queen takes b4, blundering into queen to g4 check. Very nicely spotted by Wei Yi, again just playing on the 10-second increment here. The point is that black is forced to trade queens, fixing white's structure, and this king and pawn endgame is completely lost for black, because white has 2 connected passers that the king can stop but cannot really do anything against. The king will be forced to sit here on g7, but black's pawns are going to be very stoppable and eventually captured by white's king that can simply just come up and take these pawns. The key idea being here that black cannot connect the passed pawns with b6 as white just takes here. So this king and pawn endgame is completely lost. Noterbeck tried king f7, g5, but simply resigned here as he realized there's no hope. White's king is always close enough, and this win allowed Wei Yi to overtake the lead in the tournament for the very first time in the event. Moving on to round 8, this was Magnus's game against Vincent Keimer. And here Magnus actually gets himself into a bit of trouble after this exchange on c4, followed by the c5 break. Vincent plays the correct move d5 here, very strong pawn advance. The point is if takes, and if black were to take this pawn on d5, this would be quite dangerous. For example, knight takes d5, bishop takes d5, and rook a d1, and all of black's pieces are hanging on the d file. So tactically, this is simply not working. Instead, after d5, Magnus goes a6 and just starts playing around the pawn. And white is definitely somewhat better here, but after b5, the position gets very, very complicated. After takes, the engine suggesting rook fb1 here, giving white some advantage. Instead, Keimer just grabs on b5, which is logical, but that does allow bishop takes d5, where Magnus really gets out of the worst troubles here. A couple of pieces get traded off, material remains equal. And now, actually, it's not really clear that white is even better in this position any longer. The bishop on g2 isn't a great piece, and black's knight on e5 is strong. Black is a good c-pawn as well. However, this game ends up getting decided by a blunder as Magnus starts improving his position here, pushes c3. Queen takes c3 here would run into knight to g4 check. Nice little tactic with the rook on e2 hanging. So this one can't be taken. Queen a4 is played instead, but this ends up running into an even nicer trick, knight f3 check, which Magnus does find. And now the point is after bishop takes f3, otherwise the rook takes e2, the rook is hanging here. After bishop takes f3, rook e2, bishop takes e2, there's queen takes f2 check in the position. Carlsen wins back the piece on e2 and defends the rook on b5, ends up with an extra pawn, and this is just completely winning for black as white's king here is just way too weak. Keimer threw in a check and went queen d4, but after queen f3 check, white simply had to resign here because either king g1, queen takes g3, all of white's pawns are falling, or king h2, this would run into rook to b2 check, and it's going to be mate in a couple moves. So with that, Magnus picked up his first win of the day. But also winning was Wei Yi, who ends up winning his 5th game in a row in the tournament, this one against Gukesh. Here, Gukesh, coming out of the c3 Sicilian, does play very, very aggressively with this pawn sacrifice with e6. But Wei Yi does take this one and manages to hang on. The players get a rather sharp game where white plays with a full pawn down, but with plenty of sacrifice. However, here after plenty of compensation, excuse me, here after e5, Gukesh does go wrong. He should have taken on e5, and the engine definitely thinks white has enough play here for the pawn, both after de or knight takes e5. There's a lot of weaknesses in black's position. But instead, Gukesh goes for d5, which ends up just being the wrong decision here. After knight to d4, bishop e3, bishop h6, Wei Yi does get out alive here. Bishop takes g5, takes, and black keeps the extra pawn. The king gets castled. White has a tiny bit of compensation with the knight on e4 being a good piece, but it's really not enough, and slowly black does take over in this game. Queen c7 here, taking over the c-file, rook a c8, and at this point white has not much to do except try to hold on. A lot of white's pawns are weak and there's just no play in the position. Bishop on h6 nicely covering c1 square as well. Gukesh goes for the endgame here and tries to hold on to this one, but black's rook, bishop, and d-pawn is just way too strong. Rook f5 takes this one. Black is now 2 pawns up, rook to c2, and it's just a decisive advantage here for black. Knight f2 was tried, but now g5, breaking open the diagonal nicely. Rook e1, d2, and yeah, Gukesh had seen enough here. He just resigned as he's losing more material here with g takes f4. The d-pawn is way too strong, and white's chances here are just non-existent. So that was Wei Yi's 5th win in a row in the tournament, although his streak was finally stopped in the final round of Rapid Round 9 against Pragna. Here as black, Prag pushes early on with d4, but this ends up being very, very Well played by black here as the knight has to go to a4. Black gets a nice grip over the center, stopping white's bishop on b2 here, just plays b6. And we get some simplifications here after takes on d4, knight d4. White does pick up a pawn here with bishop takes d4, but black takes on a4, bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, b takes a4. The players reach this middle game with opposite color bishops. White's extra pawn here almost completely meaningless, as black has a very simple blockade on the dark squares. And yeah, the players did play on here for quite some time. There are no draw offers allowed in the event. Draws are only allowed via a repetition or 50 move roll or something like that. But essentially there was really no chances for either side here. Eventually the queens do come off and the game was later drawn. So this slowed down Wei Yi, who ends up with 13 out of 18 points. And in the final round of the day, we also saw Carlsen against Giri. If Carlsen were to win this game, he would catch up to Wei Yi in the standings, but he ends up going wrong here rather early. This was another Italian game in the opening. And here Magnus goes bishop to e3, which is actually a surprising blunder, as Giri spent a bunch of time here, but correctly spots knight takes e4. A nice tactic that wins material for black. After knight takes e4, bishop to f5, setting up the pin. Black wins back the piece with interest. Knight d2 and now d5. Magnus goes for queen to b3 here, d takes e4, and queen takes b7, at least winning back his pawn. But bishop takes d4, now black takes on d4 and regains the extra pawn here. And this one was definitely a big advantage for black. Right now the threat is to take on e3 and then take on d2 with the queen, so white can't take on c6 here. Magnus played knight to c4. And Giri goes for c5, which definitely isn't bad. The engine was suggesting rook to e7 here, which is quite strong. The main point being that if queen takes c6, black has rook to c7, and just activating all the pieces with tempo here. Bishop to e6, rook to b8, and essentially white is just in huge trouble here. Very difficult to defend the knight on c4 and keep everything guarded in white's position. So this was definitely a big chance for Giri. If queen to b3, then rook to b8, and once again black's pieces are just way too strong. Instead, we saw c5 in the game, rook a d1, queen f6, and after the very precise move queen b6, Magnus forces the endgame here and basically ends up limiting all of the damage. He's still a pawn down, but it's hard for black to hold on to their material. The c5 pawn, a5 pawn are all weak, and objectively black is only a tiny bit better here. So the game saw some simplifications. The rook takes d4, rook takes a4. Black does keep the extra pawn, but soon everything gets liquidated into this 4 versus 3 rook endgame. And yeah, Magnus did not have too many troubles defending this one, and eventually the game was drawn. So that takes us into tomorrow and Sunday, where we're going to see 2 days of blitz action with the players playing a double round robin, 18 games. Everyone plays against each other twice over the next 2 days. Wei Yi is in the lead with 13, Magnus close behind with 12, Pragna lurking behind in 3rd place as well. Should be a very exciting 2 days ahead of us, and we will be back here for the recap. Hopefully you folks enjoy this one, and until next time, take care.